Good evening, everybody. My name is Connie Robinson. I will be your host and moderator for tonight's panel. On behalf of the CWD board, I welcome you to the second conversation in our year-long series titled The Next Normal, Building a Just and Equal Future for All Women in Washington State. Since the COVID-19 pandemic started last year, it has become clear that the pandemic only exacerbated the already existing and deeply entrenched inequality in all of its different forms. A return to normal as we knew it before the pandemic would only continue those problems. A new normal is needed. So instead of returning to a pre-COVID normal, the Center for Women and Democracy invites you to join us and treat this moment as an opportunity to build the next normal. A normal in which all women thrive, where all women's voices are heard, and women's leadership in all matters is seen as the default rather than the exception. Tonight's conversation will focus on the needs and concerns of women in rural Washington. Women in rural Washington are often rendered invisible due to the urban-rural divide and mass bipartisan politics. This has often led to the impression that women's needs in rural areas are the same as women in the urban and suburban parts of the state. So any efforts to push for gender equity and equality in the cities and suburbs will have the same or similar impact in rural areas throughout the state. However, gender inequality is firmly linked to the places in which women live and work. Solutions and policies that might work for women in cities and suburbs may not work in small towns and rural areas throughout the state. Our goal tonight is to focus directly on the needs and concerns of women in rural Washington and to learn more about what women leaders are already doing to address those needs and how we can support their effort. We make no claim that these are the only needs and concerns of women in rural Washington. We also recognize that continued conversations with women around Washington state are necessary to achieve full gender equality. Before we get started, let me cover a few important details. The panelists will speak for approximately 45 minutes, and then we will open it up for questions. If you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A box rather than the chat function. Your questions will be read on your behalf. Some questions may go unanswered or be combined with other questions based off of the number of questions that we receive and the amount of time that we have. I would now like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are holding this virtual event in Washington state and on the lands of many Native American tribes. CWD and I are based in Seattle and are thus on the land of the Duwamish. If you want to learn more, please visit the website named on the screen. I also acknowledge that Native women play an important role in rural Washington as well as other parts of Washington state. We decided to host a separate panel on their specific needs and concerns, and we'll announce the details for that panel as soon as they are concerned. Next, I invite you to take a look at the two maps of Washington state. The first map indicates the amount of land taken up by mountains, waterways, and other natural features of our state. The second map shows the number of rural counties compared to the number of rural counties in Washington state. In many ways, it shows the importance of centering the needs of women in rural areas because the vast majority of Washington state, both west and east of the Cascades, is rural. Certainly with the higher populations in the urban counties, it often leads to these counties having a disproportionate amount of power and influence over what takes place in Washington state. Let me now introduce our panelists. Instead of repeating what was on the invitation and the website, I will say something about each one that is not necessarily reflected in their bios. Wilma Cartagena. When you meet Wilma, you are immediately drawn in by her warm smile and her joyful heart. When you meet Karen Frances McWade, she is an adventurer, whether hiking in Central Washington, traveling internationally, and venturing down rabbit holes in search of information and data. Summer O'Neill, she is a bridge builder. She knows how to connect with and make people feel welcome. So with my first question, I We'll give them an opportunity to share more of their personal stories and experiences living in rural Washington. So my question to all of you is, please share your story of why and how you chose to live in rural Washington and why you are committed to supporting women in rural communities. And if you have time, or if you want to, is there an aha moment in which you knew this is exactly where you should be and what you should be doing? Let's start with Wilma.
Thank you, Connie, and thank you to all the people watching us today and engaging in this conversation. I am very honored and appreciative of the invitation. To answer your question, I ended up in Washington in 1999 by accident and not by design. I was at the time returning from overseas from where I was living with my husband and children. And he was in the Air Force at the time and now retired. And we could have ended up in the west side of Washington of McCord Air Force Base, but we ended up in Spokane. So that's where I spent most of my time, where my children grew up, and they're still there. My kids are there. And then I moved to the area of Chelan in Douglas County about 5 years ago. And having been born and raised in Puerto Rico and had traveled many places and lived in the South, in the Midwest, and different places in the US, when I got to Spokane, I will say that it was shocking and obviously coming in the middle of winter from a tropical island, that was not what I expected. But the reason why I knew this was the place that I needed to be on the east side of the mountains was an experience that I had in Spokane that really made me who I am today. It was the first time in my life where I experienced overt discrimination to my face with a client that entered the place where I was working at the time, and who told me point blank, I don't want to do business with you. You are not an American. You have an accent. You're not an American. And that was what spurred my career in social justice and how in the last 20 some years I had been working in these issues, because it was so shocking and basically just made me who I am today. And I said, there's work to be done here and I am here, so use me. And that's what I did.
Thank you, Wilma. Karen, do you want to go next?
Sure. So I was born in a small town in Arizona and came to Washington State to teach on the West Side, but then had an opportunity to come to Ellensburg and run a program at the university there. And I have to say that coming across the pass in February for my interview and seeing sunshine for the first time in what felt like months was a revelation for me. But that moment actually was not when I felt the strongest pull of home for Eastern Washington. That had actually happened 2 years before, when I had an experience twice camping in various spaces in Central Washington with a singles group from the West Side. And I couldn't care less about the people I was camping with, which, you know, probably speaks to my my outdoorsy personality. But I loved the landscape, and I fell absolutely in love with the landscape, the topography. It reminded me a lot of, especially the Kittitas County area, reminded me a lot of the desert community where I was born. And then the Wenatchee Valley reminded me a lot of the orchard community in which I was raised before becoming an adult and all. So felt really anchored first to the land and then eventually to the people. And I love living here.
And Summer.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here tonight. It's an incredible honor. I actually grew up here in Cowlitz County, primarily in Longview. My grandparents came here in the 1920s looking for economic opportunity and found it in the lumber industry. And so I grew up here. I went away to college and thought myself quite the big city girl, moved to Seattle, and I lasted all of a year before I came home. And it wasn't just, my family was of course a big draw to me coming home, but also the type of community connections that were naturally easier to build in a smaller community where you have lots of people wearing multiple hats that you run into in different organizations throughout the communities. Really made this feel, made me know why this was my home and why I decided to raise my kids here.
Thank you, Summer. And thank you all for sharing your stories. The next question is, what is one misconception, stereotype, or myth about life in rural Washington that you see as harmful to constructive dialogue on statewide issues that matter? What is your rebuttal? And we'll go with Summer first this time.
I think that there's an idea that folks in rural communities are not as concerned about environmental issues as folks in urban communities. And my personal experience has been that it's not that we're less concerned, it's that we see the answers differently. Folks in my community have been shepherding the land and the rivers and the forests for generations, and they're drawing on generational knowledge rather than what you might call more scientific studies to protect those resources. They're vital to our economies. They're vital to our way of lives. One example I think of all the time, some of my folks in my family have been commercial fishermen for a long time, and it was the commercial fishermen who blew the whistle prior to the EPA on manufacturers dumping into the river and polluting our waterways. And so we're very concerned about those issues, but we also have a different point of view on how those issues can be managed that does not necessarily always work across the whole state. It's something that needs to be handled region by region and community by community.
Thank you. Wilma?
That's an interesting question, and I think I agree with Connie. Sometimes people think that we are just out here being very conservative, not really thinking about global issues or bigger issues than just our day-to-day. And I know that's not the case. I mean, we are concerned not only about the environment, but the impact of education, the digital divide, issues that, you know, greatly impact our day-to-day living and the day-to-day living of our children and our family members. And obviously, you know, I'm a Latina living in Eastern Washington and living in Chelan Douglas. So most people think that, you know, I'm working on a farm somewhere, or that I'm just, you know, picking apples or things like that. And you know, that we have such broad concerns, not only about farming, but also about economic development in our communities. And what does that look like? What does housing looks like? So those issues that, you know, for many, the solution seems simple, but, you know, it's not as simple as that, because there's a lot of inequality and a lot of things that we are concerned about that is easy sometimes in the West Side to look back at Eastern Washington and think, oh, those folks over there, you know, they don't really care about the same things that we care about, but we do. We have some major challenges in rural areas.
Thank you. And Karen?
I agree with everything that they both just said. And I would add, there's sometimes a peculiar belief that because we have ghost towns and towns that are shrinking, that means all of our small communities are struggling and are aging out, or are enduring the effects of a brain drain because all their youth are leaving. And that's simply not true. In fact, the net migration in a lot of the rural counties across the state are actually seeing significant growth. For example, and I swear I will not get super data wonky, but I think this is an important thing to pull out and point out. And so you'll see me periodically look to my notes because that's how I go. But Benton County grew 16.7% since 2010, and Franklin County grew by 21.8%. And a lot of these counties, like Franklin County, like about a third of the population is under 18 years of age. So we have a lot of folks who are choosing to live in smaller rural counties, who are choosing to raise their children and their families in these communities, and who want them to stay. You know, we're not raising them so that they can take flight and go away and hopefully come back home, even though that's certainly a trajectory that a lot of folks do take. We're also laying the foundation so that they can come of age here, build their lives here, have their educations here, build their businesses and their careers here. And we have the capacity with quality partnership to get it done.
I want to return to one point that Summer raised. I think it's an interesting question to explore a little bit deeper because, as you've all said, you know, there's a lot of misconceptions about rural Washington and what's going on. But one of the things I'm hearing throughout all of your answers, there's similar concerns, but different answers, or it's the same concerns, but different answers itself. And can each of you provide a specific example of where there's, other than me, of course, you can elaborate on the example you've already given, but think about something in terms of, you know, we're concerned about this issue, but it does it. The solution that's being offered maybe that would work in Seattle or Olympia doesn't work in our area. Does someone want to go first? Summer?
I think that the most obvious example of that for me is proposals for mileage tax that come down disproportionately on rural communities. I live 8 miles from the nearest grocery store. I don't have the option to ride my bike into town for a gallon of milk. You know, whereas folks that are in a more urban environment that have access to more robust public transit and are just dealing with a smaller geographic area are dealing with different barriers than we are. And that, I think, is a good example of it's good policy for an urban area, but it backfires on a rural area that just doesn't have those options available.
Summer, I think that's a great example. And from a personal perspective, because I lived 27 miles outside the Wenatchee and East Wenatchee where I worked, you know, having that kind of regressive tax impacts people that live in that work out here because we have to drive. There's not really easy transportation to us. We have no option but to drive our cars. So that creates a barrier for a lot of folks to really access what they need because it makes it harder for them to just really in the pocketbook, basically.
Agreed. Yeah, with my employer, I'm fortunate in that I can periodically get a rental car to cover my region. My region is all of Chelan, Douglas, Okanagan County, and right now including Kittitas, Yakima, Klickitat County. So on those days where I can't rent a car, if I actually have to cover all that distance, I would be quite concerned about that mileage tax as a way of addressing the revenue needs for the state. I also think we need to think creatively around housing and housing models, housing sizes, housing types. I was just on a call earlier today, and it is a real struggle to find builders who will build in a lot of our counties. It's distance, it's the building supplies, all that sort of thing. But sometimes the models of housing types that make sense in urban spaces don't always work here. But sometimes they can. Like, we are starting to see conversations around smaller communities wanting to see mixed use, live, work, housing designs. Some could even be transit served, because we do, some communities do have, mass transit available, but we're not seeing a lot of the partners who are innovative in that work in the urban spaces taking our needs seriously and showing up as partners to think really creatively and affordably to meet our needs. We don't want to just become or remain a second home housing stock. We really want to be able to have workforce housing that is reasonably priced given the area median income for our counties.
Thank you. Sorry, I lost my questions. Let's start with Karen this time. From your perspective, what are some concerns of women in rural Washington that need to be addressed in order to achieve equity and equality for all women in Washington state?
Okay, now I made a whole list. The first and foremost, well, maybe not, well, anyways, affordable housing. So housing types, affordable housing, variety of housing types. We don't have, I think there are just maybe a handful of condo developments in Chelan County. They stopped building duplexes in the 80s. So there's a whole, they call it the missing middle, right, for housing, that is truly missing, a whole swath of housing types that stopped being developed. And yet those were the pathways by which people were able to come into home ownership and build wealth. And so that really jeopardizes things for folks who are just trying to get in the door. Related to the affordable housing issue, the lack of emergency shelters. We have heard, and the data shows that there has been an acute need for shelters, particularly related to domestic violence in this last year. And we don't have a lot of resources to meet that growing need. Increasingly, as the pandemic has also showed us, a lot of the work can be done remotely, but if you don't have reliable internet service that is, fast, that is a problem. And we do have some folks who are working really hard with the state broadband office and with various stakeholders across the regions to address that issue, but recognizing that rural internet is just as important as rural electrification was back in the early 20th century. And childcare. Diversity of childcare options, the availability to support shift work, particularly given the number of women who work in food processing and value-added agriculture. We just kind of need things that make it easier for folks to have healthy, safe family lives.
Who would like to go next?
I agree with Karen. I think all those issues are very important. And affordable housing, I think, I didn't mention this in the misconceptions about rural areas, but I think most people or my friends that live in the website think that you come to a place like Wenatchee and you pay very little low rent. But no, I mean, if you come to Wenatchee, your rent is going to be at least $1,000 or it was $1,200 when I moved. When I was living in Spokane, I was paying $700. That's a huge difference. So affordable housing here in the Wenatchee, Chelan Douglas area is a huge issue. And COVID really, and I always want to preface this by the fact that I'm coming from the perspective of the Latino community where I do most of my work. And when COVID hit and school shut down and children went out to the homes, we found ourselves scrambling to find hotspots and computers where children in a household with three, 5 kids in different grade levels, they couldn't log on to school because everybody had to share the same computer or they had to use the technology and it was basically a phone, and a lot of the parents didn't know how to use that technology. So we found that big gap in family household in terms of they may have some access, but they still didn't know how to use it to do it. And I think we don't think about those households and how do we bridge those gaps in education to ensure that every child had the same opportunities, that they're getting the same services. It's a lot easier in the website to find services here, and I particularly know a family that moved out of the area, well-off family and educated family who have to move because they couldn't find services for their child that was autistic, because the services in the schools area are so limited in special ed and those other areas. So I'm always find myself wrestling with how do we ensure that schools in our area are receiving the adequate amount of funding, and that these issues are at the forefront of legislators in the West Side who are making these decisions, and even our local legislators. I mean, are they really thinking about programs that enhance the life of every student, and just not those that are already doing well? And I think everybody is well-intentioned and want to do it. It's just that there are barriers there that need to be removed. And there's issues of representation. We are not at the table. So we can bring these issues to the forefront if we're not there. Somebody else is speaking for us. And that's a big issue for me personally.
Yeah, I agree with both of you wholeheartedly. The housing issue, at least here in Cowlitz County, has changed very quickly in the last 5 years. Some of our home values have doubled pretty much overnight and put home ownership out of the reach of many middle-class families, to which that was kind of a given that would be affordable for a middle-class family in Cowlitz County. But I also wanted to bring some attention to the lack of elder care options that are available in rural communities. In Cowlitz County, we have quite a few options, but for folks that need Medicaid support for their parents, that's very difficult to find in our county. We're usually having to move parents down to maybe an hour away to Vancouver in order to find care for them. And as you go a little bit west of us into Wahkiakum and to Pacific counties, there are absolutely no options for assisted living or nursing home care. Their folks are coming to Longview, our folks are going to Vancouver, and I think that is a burden that falls disproportionately on women in the family as the caregivers for both their parents and their children.
And we're also wrestling now with the issue of homelessness and how to house those who are chronically homeless. I mean, you would think that we don't have any homeless in these areas, but we do. And the problem is increasing in our area.
Thank you, everybody. I guess the next question, I was wondering if it was appropriate to ask the next question, but I think it still works for our purposes right now. What are people already doing to work on these issues? Have you come up with some unique and creative solutions to address the issues? And where do you need statewide assistance, I should say, in terms of statewide support on these issues? Well, Matt, we'll start with you since you finished.
Well, I must say, yeah, that it's always good to name the problem, right? But it's also good to provide solutions and to name the things that are happening. So one of the things that I do really see in our area is a lot of collaboration from different folks. whether it's the nonprofit sector or the businesses through the Chamber of Commerce or the North Central Economic Development District and the counties and the ports and everybody, at least they're trying. They are, what I think what's missing is we need more diverse people at the table. And when I say diverse, I'm not really always speaking about racial diversity. I'm speaking about we need all of us, because sometimes I find myself in these meetings that sometimes I'm one of maybe 3 women or the only Hispanic or Latinx in there. And I hardly ever see anybody with a physical disability. So when we're talking about housing, we're really looking at our sidewalks and our, things that make their accessibility issues that they from and center. So I think what is lacking sometimes is really considering it's everybody that is supposed to be at the table here so we can address these issues together. But the collaboration is happening and there's some really good things. And another thing that it really encourages me is to see the level of engagement and activism of our young folks. Our young people are aware, they're engaged, and they really are pushing us. I feel like they're the ones challenging me to just do more and to sometimes just simply get out of the way. Just let them tell you. Because I see a lot of that now happening more than before. And maybe it's a silver lining of COVID if there was ever one, that people have been forced to work together. People that otherwise probably would have never gotten together. We saw that with the technology issue at the school. We saw that in finding solutions for farm workers who were left out from testing or, getting people separated so they wouldn't catch COVID. So we've seen a lot of collaborations in agencies, but we still feeling like we need more people from other dimensions of the diversity spectrum.
Summer, how about you go next?
I have seen a lot of collaboration. We have some incredible women and men working in our nonprofit sectors that are building these collaborations together so that we can stop all, building these silos and start working together to make projects that benefit all of us. But one of my biggest frustrations is that there are actually a lot of dollars out there for working on homelessness and housing that some of our elected officials have been reluctant to go after. For instance, we don't have a grant writer for Cowlitz County. And so those dollars just get left on the table. And so I think that there are a lot of opportunities that we're missing to improve the lives of folks in our community simply because we don't have folks at the table that are willing to reach out and grab those opportunities and make them available to our citizens.
Okay. What was your question again?
What's being done?
Yes.
What can be done better?
Great. Well, so I'll take rural broadband as an example. The state is working with a lot of stakeholders across the state to try to get folks to, participate in the broadband speed test so that we could have a pretty clear baseline understanding of what people's actual internet speeds are. And some of the counties that were really kind of lagging behind, they brought a bunch of partners onto the table or around the table who were like, no, we need this data. And they leveraged all of their networks to actually get almost everyone in some of these counties measured, and it's been interesting seeing how nonprofits, small businesses, municipal and county governments, school districts, all are rallying together around this common need of, okay, we know there's money coming from the feds around this infrastructure to support broadband development. How do we position our community by working well together as equals and peers to get this data and create a vision for what we want to do with respect to meeting the needs of our communities? And so that's been really lovely to see. We're seeing more engagement with philanthropy as well. And I'm also impressed by the type of philanthropy that seems to be showing up. I'd say like maybe a few years ago, most of the philanthropy partners would come in with a little bit of a savior mentality. Like, here's the theory of change, and we think your community is going to be perfect as a test case for fleshing out this theory of change. So here's the money, but you just got to do it the way we think it needs to be done. And then, you know, we're going to learn from you, basically using you as a lab rat. That's not the dynamic that seems to be dominant anymore. Instead, they're coming and saying, we recognize that we don't know much about your community, and we'd like to partner with you. We have resources, but we don't know you. So why don't you tell us what you need and how we can help, and we'll happily fund it, and, you know, work with you on the reporting side of things, and help you meet your goals. And so that willingness of folks who have assets and resources to show up in our communities, to learn, to listen, and to actively, collaboratively partner, as opposed to direct and save, that has been a nice change. And frankly, it's better received. You know, there's a saying that some of my colleagues in Chelan County in particular like to say that I think is true across all communities: nothing about us without us. So don't set policy, create a theory of change, design a program, and we're not at the table. And at the table as co-creators, not as, you know, window dressing. And so I think we're seeing a lot of that ethic of inclusion happening both in our communities themselves. Like, a lot more folks are asking who's not at this table, who should be locally. And then that's also playing out in terms of how we relate to folks who are not from our communities. And I think that's the healthiest direction any of us can go.
One final question, and then we'll open it up to the audience and hear their questions. I guess for an organization that's based in Puget Sound area, mostly in the Everett to Tacoma and by extension Olympia corridor, what are some of the things that you would like us to do or to support your efforts? And how can we help? Put it this way.
Visit us. Come and spend some time in our communities. That's always, I think, is the first step. Just go visit, meet the people, engage in the conversations at the local level. So you just don't hear from a few folks. I mean, you can see for yourself what's happening that is interesting and new and innovative, and what's missing, and then become a partner. That's always my advice. But one of the first requisites, I think, for anybody, they ask me, how can I help? Come see us.
But safely, you know, because we're still in the pandemic. But as you do, I mean, that's one thing I will say, like, I was starting to try to wean myself from Facebook, and I recognize that Facebook continues to be quite a force in the way that our communities interact with one another. Instagram, I'm starting to learn because I have to, but really in terms of getting the nitty-gritty of how communities are connecting with one another, especially the smaller communities, Facebook is a really great tool. Yeah, like, research us, like, connect with the local Rotaries. If you're in a Rotary Club on the West Side, be a visitor, you know, get an invitation to a Rotary meeting on, you know, in a rural community, whether it's on the East Side or in one of the rural communities on the West Side. Subscribe to some of the newsletters with like the North Central, the educational service districts. There's one down in Yakima, there's one up here. They're all over the state. And so there are plenty of ways to start getting to know the communities on our own terms and kind of on our own turf. But by all means, yeah, when you feel it's safe, come and visit. And if you, we're happy to connect with folks who genuinely want to understand and respect us, and respect our needs, and rural life isn't a consolation prize. We're pretty happy living in rural communities, and we'd love to show you why, but not because we want to become an urban community. I mean, I've already lived in urban communities, lived in New York, Denver, places in California. I've chosen a rural life for a reason. I just want to be part of improving the diversity of resources and opportunities for myself, for my child, and any, future generations as well. Yeah. How about you, Summer?
I think you said that really well, Karen, and it's really nice to have 3 rural women here who did make that as a choice, because I think that there's often the misconception that folks who are in rural communities are there because they're stuck there, that they didn't have an opportunity to get out. And that's really, for many of us, not the case. We're here because we love our communities and we love our way of life. And we're really open and wanting to share that with anyone who's interested in. And so I just would really encourage policymakers from the urban areas to listen not only to the issues that we have, but we've got a lot of great ideas for solutions too that are unique to our communities. And they're not going to work in every rural community in the state, because we all have different resources and problems that are presenting in different ways. And to just keep a really open mind about what those solutions can look like.
Thank you, everybody. I think just trying to decide which question to take first here based off of what you just said. I think I will keep them, ask the questions in the order they're received. Nancy asks, with the option to work outside, are you seeing the rural counties becoming, excuse me, Nancy, with the option to work offsite, are we seeing the rural counties becoming more desirable with in-migration to some of these? Are you concerned about the changes that growth may initiate?
I mean, I suppose it depends on the type of growth, I mean, certainly we are seeing to Summer's point earlier, like home prices are going through the roof. And so the communities that really invested ages ago in building out a really robust electrical and internet infrastructure, like Chelan County, Douglas County in particular, with the hydroelectric and the fiber network, the Zoomtown reality has just gone insane. I don't know that I will ever be able to buy a home for my daughter and I. We have a cute little place now, but it's on rented land, and I don't know that I ever will be able to afford a place on my own land because I can't keep up with the pace of the demand, and we aren't building enough houses to keep up with the pace of the demand. I think we will start to see some pushback, particularly if there are increasing demands on the water and waste management infrastructure, which we are also working on. I mean, obviously you can't make more water, but you can build out more robust waste management and recycling structures and infrastructure, but a lot of that isn't quite done yet. So yeah, I mean, I'm certainly concerned about the pace of the demand, the fact that at this point, I'm a state employee, single parent, competing with, someone maybe pulling down 6 figures from a tech job in Seattle who's just kind of done with Seattle and can remote work from here. that's going to be a challenge.
Yeah, I would say that I'm very concerned about that, and particularly concerned that we have not done much planning for what is happening now, which I think is unfortunate, because I think that we're at risk of losing control of our destiny in that way. And I'm not really sure what the answer is there at this point. I think, we may have actually already crossed some kind of point of no return on that one.
I don't know that I am concerned, but I want to be more aware and paying attention, because for me, what I would not like is that we become a stopover destination for just to play, because I mean, we love it that people visit. We need people to visit for economic development and infusion into our economy. So we love visitors. And I can say that I live in a town in Orondo that only have 2,000 people, and I live very close to the river. And I have seen the build out of Mac mansions or big houses right around the river. And I know some of the folks are really concerned that that's just really things don't last forever. Our natural resources, we have to take care of it. So I'm worried that we don't have a plan in place, or maybe there is and I just are not aware of the plan. But making sure that this influx is beneficial to both, to the people that come, but also to the people that live here. So we just have to develop strategies on how to deal with it, because it's going to happen anyway. I mean, it's not like it's not happening already, but it does put a strain on natural resources. And we saw a couple of years ago, I think early when I moved in here, there was a big conversation about Bitcoin, because Douglas County was building those big Bitcoin warehouses. I don't know what they look like. I mean, they were just huge things. And, that put a strain and demand on an electric grid. So there has to be a moratorium about that. So there is things that are happening like that, because we have really great energy but it's a scarce resource. So we have to be looking at those when these things are happening, not to mention the housing crisis that it appears to be affecting every place in Washington state.
Thank you. Next question from a health professional who is retired. I continue to be concerned about access to women's health care, especially in our rural communities. Do you share these worries? And I'll add to that, are there specific examples that you would like to highlight, or specific concerns you would like to highlight that surround the issue of access to healthcare for women?
Well, beyond the political tug of war over women's health, there is the sheer economics of the struggle of rural hospitals. We have had, and I know the hospitals in Okanagan County were really struggling, and certainly COVID has impacted the revenue models for all of our hospitals, because the elective surgeries that were helping to actually keep the lights on and pay for the specialists and such were just tabled. And so there just wasn't as much of a reserve to be able to provide standard care and ongoing care. So I am nervous that we don't have enough of I suppose, of reserves with respect to our hospitals. We don't have a lot of clinics. I mean, we have Planned Parenthoods around, and they don't, they provide the whole gamut of healthcare to women and men. And I guess, I mean, my daughter, she's 11, so I haven't really allowed myself to think too much about what's coming up next. And I'm happily middle-aged and, happy with my doctor, but I'm lucky in that I have good insurance. My doctor doesn't seem to be going anywhere, and the hospital has rebounded a bit given the financial challenges that they face. But I do worry about the very rural communities where their local hospitals are on life support and have been even before COVID.
I really haven't given much thought to that question of I guess because I always had insurance and I'm one of those lucky few that is privileged enough to always had insurance for really good healthcare. And I think I'm with Karen that my biggest concern is really about accessibility and for those folks who lack insurance. But I don't think I've given enough thought to the issue of women healthcare because it's always been available to me. And I'm one of the lucky few, I guess.
I think even before COVID that it could be a struggle to, particularly to obtain prenatal care and delivery services in your local community as a rural resident. I know personally because of the health plan that I had at the time that I had my two children, I traveled 40 miles one way for each of my prenatal appointments. And that, you know, folks who live further out, perhaps in Pacific County, their hospital only has about 6 beds and is not at all equipped to take care of any kind of emergency or severe complications that go along with birth. And even here in Longview, if you deliver a baby that is compromised, that needs some more intensive care, that baby's being flown to Portland and you're gonna be sitting here in that hospital in Longview waiting to find out what happened to them. So those pieces were always a concern before the pandemic. And I know that as you both said, with elective surgery revenue going down, that we've seen quite a few cuts in those services that are available. I know we have some clinics, primary care clinics out in Pacific County that are only open on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So if you have a medical issue on any other day of the week, well, you're going to wait or you're going to drive. And so that's to me unacceptable, but it, you know, there's so many moving pieces there as far as reimbursement rates and reasons that providers don't want to locate in rural areas that really need to be tackled, I think, at the legislative level.
And I think in that question, because it was specific about women healthcare, but I think if I want to broaden that question, I know that in the Latinx community, especially in the farm worker community, we have a lot of seasonal migrant farm workers and H-2A workers, and they may not have access to the quality of care that they need because of the transitory nature of the work. And the fear that if they go to a hospital, they get sick or go to hospital, they lose their jobs. So there are other dimensions to the healthcare question that need to be examined. How do we provide that accessibility and remove some of those barriers for those more communities where they don't have good health insurance? That's really an issue that we had to tackle as well.
Thank you, everybody. And the final question, how are you envisioning the infrastructure changes we need in rural areas to support adequate bandwidth and access to technology for children who are learning online and may continue to do so if widespread school openings are delayed? This is also really important consideration for delivering healthcare via telehealth.
Well, I mean, I think what that infrastructure is going to look like is going to depend on the communities, on the topography of the communities. You know, some can actually, you know, some of the flatter communities that can accommodate buried utilities or even, you know, hung ones. We'll see that type of infrastructure put in. Others that are up in the hills where that kind of brick and mortar infrastructure really cannot take place at any sort of affordable price point. might see interventions like Skynet. There's the NCW Economic Development District is working on bringing in like a sort of satellite type high-speed internet for parts of the Antioch Valley that will likely never see the physical fiber because of the topography. So I think a lot of it will be dependent upon the amount of money that is sent to our state, that our state is able to access. And I know the broadband office is working hard to make sure that those resources are heavily leveraged to support our state. It's exciting to see companies like Microsoft pushing into rural communities. I mean, just today, I read an article about Microsoft building a campus in Douglas County. So they're already very well established in Grant County, and they have their Tech Spark program that's working with educators across rural communities in North Central Washington. And now they're expanding into Douglas County. And so I think if we see more corporate partners who have the capacity to help build out some of the infrastructure in a way that doesn't, that creates genuine opportunity for the communities, then I think that's one way that the infrastructure needs could be met as well. But I think it's going to be an all hands on decks, and probably not a lot of wrong ideas. It's going to be about partnership and collaboration and just leveraging our assets when I'm talking too much. So Summer, Wilma, what do you guys think?
I'll go. I agree. I think topography will dictate a lot of how that infrastructure is going to look like. But for me, and I always think about, okay, it's fine to build it. I mean, if we can build it, if there's resources, I know that a lot of people building it. But I'm starting to think about the internet as a need for everyone, because everything now is online. So how do we pay for it? I think it's a bigger question. It's to become a utility. That, I mean, do we need to regulate it as a utility so everybody have access, everybody can have it, and it's not just a few companies who can provide it? I think that's where my headspace is in terms of internet and broadband and all that. And I don't really know a lot about those issues. I'm just beginning to scratch the surface on that particular thing. But for me, it's just more about, okay, we build it, but what if people have to have an ISP and they can afford to pay for it? And I guess it's the same but it's actually something that you need now. If you lose your job and you need to apply for a job, it's going to be online. So, I mean, you don't always have access to a library where you can go and do that in a rural community. You might have to drive 40 miles to the nearest library. So how do you apply for a job? Those are the questions in my head. So infrastructure, obviously we live in a valley and lots of different kind of things that they will have to do.
I'm very excited about the bill in the legislature to allow our PUDs to serve directly to customers. I think that could solve a lot of problems. What we see here, talk about topography, is we've got a lot of these little winding roads that, you can build the line, but it's only going to maybe serve 1,000 people. And so it's not worth it to the big telecom companies to invest in that infrastructure. And so I think it's really important that we start looking at internet as a public utility and not a private enterprise.
Wow, thank you, everybody. I second many of the comments in the chat. This has been an eye-opening conversation, and it's a conversation that needs to be had. And someone's even talking about, trying to get you together with some legislators, or at least folks who can advocate and lobby those legislators. So thank you for such a great discussion tonight. And just, sorry, got so into the conversation, I lost track of where I was at. So let me get back on track here. I wanted to offer some thanks. First, of course, to all the panelists here for taking time out of your very busy lives to share your stories and experiences and helping us to better understand the needs and concerns of women in rural Washington. As we're learning so much, I grew up in rural Washington. I thought I knew what the issues were in rural Washington. And I just like, oh, they're just gonna say, repeat what I already know, but no, you talked about things that I had not even considered. And so I personally am very thankful for that. And I thank the audience for attending tonight. And I hope that you are inspired and motivated to support their efforts and to use your vote as well as your consumer dollars in order to help support the economies, the lives of people living in the rural parts of the state. I also wanted to offer a personal comment and a personal thank you. I want to give a special call out to Amber, a friend of Summer. I met Amber a few years ago at an event and knew that she was very involved in politics in Southwest Washington. I initially invited Amber to speak on this panel. Yet within a day or so, she sent me another email and said that I should invite Summer instead. I think she was underplaying her abilities, but we'll have just get her at another conversation some point in the future. But it was a great example of women lifting women up. And that moment came exactly when I needed it. And that gracious act reminded me that this is exactly why we need women's leadership. And for that, I thank you, Amber. With that, I'll conclude and say, please check your emails, check your Facebook page. We are working on some wonderful events. We are still have not confirmed the details, so we are not announcing them just in case something changes. We also look forward to having you attend all the conversations that we're going to have throughout 2021. And I'll conclude by saying we look forward to working with you all to achieve gender equality in Washington. Have a great evening. Goodbye.